Fighters coming in.
Return of the Jedi was released when I was 20 years old, and it has always been one of my favourite films. I still remember a friend sitting next to me worried that Luke might eventually be pulled over to the dark side, and at the time, I thought that was impossible. Return of the Jedi was made to end with hope. What few people notice, however, is that this film was built around an ending that was once rejected because it turned Luke into something Star Wars did not allow its hero to become. An ending where darkness is not defeated but passed on, and where the myth collapses in its final moment. To keep the story alive, the film chose not to go there and concealed many things along the path back toward the light. The 12 dark secrets below reveal what Return of the Jedi has avoided confronting for decades. 12. The rebel plan was to sacrifice Luke Skywalker. I still remember how it felt the first time I watched Return of the Jedi Luke, dressed in black, more restrained, more silent. When he separates from Leia and Han and goes alone to Death Star 2. The theatre went completely quiet. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood this was the most dangerous part of the film. A friend whispered, "What if Luke doesn't come back?" Back then, I believed the Rebel Alliance must have had a plan, a rescue team on standby, or at least some contingency if things went wrong. The film didn't show it, but surely it existed, or so I reassured myself. But when you watch again with a clearer head, an unsettling truth emerges. The rebels had no plan to save Luke. There were no emergency discussions, no reserve forces prepared, not even a plan B, in case Luke was tortured, brainwashed, or killed. Luke voluntarily surrendered himself, and the rebels accepted that decision with chilling calm. Mon Mothma Akbar. The entire command structure, no one objected, and no one asked. What if Luke fails? Because in their calculations the answer was already clear. The Endor operation would continue regardless. That can only mean one thing. Luke Skywalker was a piece they were willing to sacrifice. The Rebel Alliance is usually portrayed as the good side, but in this moment they are not so different from the Empire. Both are willing to place the life of a young individual on the board as long as the balance of war tips in their favour. Luke is no longer a human being with fear, doubt and the possibility of failure. He is a strategic asset, a symbol bait for Vader and Palpatine. Hope it turns out must be paid for in blood, and Luke Skywalker, in that version of the story, is ready to become the perfect martyr. 11. Vader was not redeemed. He simply died at the right moment. When I was younger, I cried when Vader removed his mask, his eyes tired, his voice weak. A father seeing his son for the first time with his own eyes. It is a powerful moment and an easy one to believe that everything has been forgiven. But the older I get, the more that death feels too convenient. Anakin Skywalker never truly confronts what he has done. No apology to the millions of victims, no accountability beyond dying. He saves Luke a deeply personal act and then immediately exits the story. And the film calls that redemption. But if Vader had survived, the moral implications would have been unbearable. Can a war criminal be forgiven simply because he loves his child? Vader's death is not just tragedy. It is a narrative escape hatch. It slams shut every difficult question before the audience has time to ask it. No trial ever takes place. No justice is carried out. One emotional moment and the screen fades to black. When Anakin appears as a Force ghost beside Obi-Wan and Yoda, his past is completely sanitized. There are no screams from torture chambers, no planets burned to ash. History is rewritten in soft blue light. That is not forgiveness. That is the erasure of collective memory. Return of the Jedi chooses emotion over morality, because true morality would destroy the happy ending. Vader dies at exactly the right moment, and because of that, the myth remains intact, even if the truth is buried with him. 10. The darkest ending. Luke kills Vader and becomes a Sith. Back then, sitting in the theatre and watching Luke lash out at Vader with fury in his eyes, I remember briefly considering a possibility the film refused to pursue. Not because I wanted it to happen, but because everything on screen seemed to be moving in that direction. The red light of the throne room, Vader's laboured breathing, Luke's strikes growing more frantic, more uncontrolled, no longer resembling the calm of a Jedi. In that moment, the ending we received was no longer the only possible outcome. In fact, there was once a version that Return of the Jedi nearly followed. In that idea, Luke does not stop. He kills Vader in anger, not out of duty, but out of loss, resentment, and fear of being weak. And immediately afterward, instead of turning away from Palpatine, Luke accepts the power of the dark side, dons Vader's helmet, and steps into the empty space beside the throne. Had that ending remained, the story would have closed in a loop of chilling perfection. Anakin falls because he wants to save the one he loves. Luke falls because he cannot endure loss. The Jedi Order does not merely fail, it is erased entirely, not as a flawed institution in need of reform, but as a dream that has ended. Evil is not destroyed. It simply changes faces, voices, generations. That is precisely why this ending was rejected. It destroys the entire message of hope that Star Wars wants to leave behind. It states plainly what myth refuses to admit, that sometimes people do not overcome darkness, and destiny does not always offer a way out. It is an ending too honest, too cruel, and therefore impossible to exist in a story designed to be a spiritual refuge for generations. 9. The Jedi Order had already failed, and Yoda knew it. Have you ever thought of Yoda's death as a moment of succession? The Master departs. The student steps forward. A beautiful closed circle. But when you listen closely to every word Yoda speaks, that feeling changes colour. Yoda does not die because his mission is complete. He dies because there is nothing left for him to do. When Luke asks whether there are any other Jedi, Yoda admits the bare truth: there is no plan B. Luke is not the chosen one in the mythic sense. Luke is simply the last one left. Not because he is perfect, but because every other option is dead in hiding or has failed. The Jedi Order collapsed long ago. It was not wiped out in a single night. It destroyed itself through dogma, arrogance, and the belief that it was always right. Yoda knows this, Obi-Wan knows this, but they have no choice left except to place all their hope in a young man who is not ready. So when Luke wins, it is not a victory for the Jedi. It is survival born of desperation. The Jedi do not triumph because the light is more righteous than the dark. They win because there is no one else left to try. The film presents that moment as hope, but looked at directly, it is a final gamble. And Yoda does not depart in peace, but in bitter acceptance that the order he once protected has failed, rescued only by telling the story in a way that is gentler than reality. 8. Palpatine is not mad. He is right about human nature. In many people's memories, Palpatine appears as a fairy tale demon, pure evil, cackling grotesquely as lightning bursts from his withered hands. But the more I revisit the film, the more I realise that what is truly terrifying about Palpatine is not his power, but his calm observation of human nature. Palpatine does not try to convince Luke through brute force. He does not immediately resort to torture or threats. What he offers instead is an uncomfortable truth: when pushed into loss, human beings will choose violence. Not because they are evil, but because violence is the final reflex for regaining control. Luke proves this in the very moment he nearly kills Vader. Palpatine simply sits and watches, waiting, trusting that anger will finish the work. At that point, Palpatine is not wrong. Luke truly comes dangerously close to the dark side, not because he is deceived, but because he is human. And humans are not immune to despair. Palpatine loses not because his philosophy is false, but because he miscalculates a single fragile moment. Luke stops, not because Palpatine is exposed, but because Luke is afraid of what he sees himself becoming. It is an extraordinarily fragile victory built on a split second of self-awareness, not on an unshakable truth. What is frightening is this. If that moment had passed a little faster, if Luke had not seen Vader's mechanical hand, then Palpatine would have been entirely right. And the film chooses not to dig into that truth, because admitting how deeply Palpatine understands humanity would blur the line between evil and reality too much for the audience to feel safe. 7. Leia is stripped of power in her own film. Do you remember Leia in the earlier films, tough sharp, needing no protection? Ready to fire a blaster and make decisions in life or death situations? Leia is not just a princess. She is a leader, a warrior, the strategic mind of the Rebel Alliance. That is why, when watching Return of the Jedi, I once felt a vague sense that something had changed, even if I could not yet name it. In this film, Leia is still present, but her power is deliberately softened. She becomes the lover waiting for Han, the sister who needs protection, and ultimately a device to domesticate the story. Major decisions no longer rest with Leia. Her strategic role is pushed into the background, making room for emotion and personal relationships. This shift is not accidental. It serves a very clear purpose to make the ending feel gentler. A strong, independent woman, willing to question power and morality, would make the story far more uncomfortable. Instead, the film chooses to turn Leia into an emotional anchor, encouraging the audience to focus on the Skywalker family rather than confront the political and moral consequences of the war. The cost of that choice is a once powerful character reduced to serve the myth. Leia does not disappear, but her voice is lowered so the story can close in a false sense of peace. And in hindsight, we realize that even in victory, certain powers have been stripped away not by the Empire, but by the way the story itself is told. 6. The Ewoks are primitive warfare, not a children's fairy tale. Though, when I was young, I laughed a lot when the Ewoks first appeared. Small, furry creatures speaking a language no one understands, darting through the forest as if they had stepped out of a fairy tale. At the time, the Ewoks were what made Return of the Jedi feel lighter, more playful, and safer for children. But the older I get and the more slowly I rewatch the film, the more I realise that this cheerful feeling hides something deeply unsettling. The Ewoks do not defeat the Empire through innocence. They win through raw violence. Wooden traps are built to crush stormtroopers, massive logs slam directly into formations. Rocks rain down from above. Fire is used to burn enemies alive. And most importantly, there is encirclement by sheer numbers, the oldest weapon of tribal warfare. This is not civilized war. It is the kind of violence modern societies like to pretend they have outgrown when in reality they have only pushed it out of sight. The Ewoks fight the way humanity's distant ancestors did, defending territory, exterminating invaders without rules, without mercy. The film turns all of this into comedy through playful sound effects, gentle camera work, and cute reactions. Because if the film paused even briefly, if it allowed the audience to think, the question would immediately arise: how did those soldiers die? And once that question is asked, Return of the Jedi ceases to be a children's story and becomes a reminder that victory is always built on very ancient forms of violence, simply retold in a way that is easier to swallow. 5. The Battle of Endor is a massacre framed as a festival. I remember very clearly the excitement I felt during the Battle of Endor. The pacing is fast, the music driving the Ewoks and rebels working together, the Empire steadily losing ground. It is one of the most visually satisfying battles in Star Wars, a moment where the audience is allowed to celebrate without hesitation. And that comfort is precisely what makes it troubling. At Endor, stormtroopers die in large numbers, but none of them are named. There are no scenes of comrades grieving, no bodies lingering in frame, and no moment of silence to remind us that these are human beings rather than moving targets. They are reduced to obstacles, things the heroes must remove on their way to final victory. This is a classic propaganda technique. Make the enemy anonymous, so killing them carries no moral weight. When the opposing side has no face, no story, no family. Waiting at home, violence becomes far easier to accept. The Battle of Endor is staged as a celebration, not because there is little blood, but because the blood has been removed from the audience's awareness. In that moment, war is no longer a tragedy. It becomes a game where the right side always wins and the wrong side simply disappears from the screen. Return of the Jedi needs this framing for its ending to feel complete, because if Endor were shown for what it truly is, a slaughter in the forest, the joy of victory would immediately take on a very different shade. 4. Music conceals the emptiness. Perhaps no element makes Return of the Jedi easier to watch than its music. The score arrives at exactly the right moments, lifts emotion precisely where needed, and carries us from tension to relief without requiring reflection. But try imagining this film without John Williams' music. Vader's death would no longer feel moving. It would be a cold silence between two exhausted people. Victory would carry no heroic echo, only a void after everything is over. And Luke would not stand bathed in mythic light but alone amid corpses, ashes and unanswered questions. The music does more than heighten emotion. It instructs you how to feel. It tells you when to cry, when to relax, and when to believe that everything is finally okay. Without it, Return of the Jedi would be a far darker film, one where victory does not erase loss and light is not strong enough to dissolve the darkness. That is why the music becomes a perfect veil. It does not change what happens on screen, but it changes how we remember it. And once memory has been guided that way, it becomes easy to believe this is the right ending, even when beneath the melody lies an emptiness. The film never wants us to linger on long enough to truly feel. 3. Anakin's appearance as a Force ghost is a whitening of history. There is a moment in Return of the Jedi that almost everyone remembers, yet very few ever stop to question. It is the moment when Luke looks into the distance and 3 spirits appear in soft light, standing side by side like sages who have completed their mission. The scene passes quickly, gently, like a final nod from the film, assuring us that everything has been resolved. But precisely because it is so beautiful, it has grown more disturbing to me over time. Anakin Skywalker stands there carrying none of the traces of what he has done. No blood, no pain, no memory of destroyed planets or lives crushed in darkness. Everything that once made him Darth Vader disappears as if it never existed. What remains is a purified image, just enough for the audience to nod and say, "He has been forgiven." But that is not forgiveness. Forgiveness requires confronting guilt. Forgiveness requires memory to remain intact so that pain is not denied. This ghostly scene does none of that. Instead, it performs something far more subtle. It erases collective memory through a beautiful image. When Anakin stands equal to Obi-Wan and Yoda, history is rewritten in the most palatable way possible. There is no longer a perpetrator, only a lost soul. No victims, only legend. The film does not need to lie. It merely needs to choose an image powerful enough to replace the parts of history that are inconvenient to remember. And when audiences leave the theatre with that image in mind, the truth has been permanently blurred not by words, but by emotion. 2. Turning the story into a family drama to avoid political responsibility. One of the reasons Return of the Jedi is so easy to love is its deeply personal feeling. Fathers and sons, brothers and sisters. A broken family reunited. When the story contracts into blood ties, the audience is given a clear emotional anchor to hold on to. But that choice carries a far greater consequence. When all conflict is framed as family drama, political responsibility disappears. War is no longer about power systems or ideology, it becomes personal tragedy. The Empire is no longer a galaxy-scale killing machine, it becomes a misguided father. The rebellion is no longer a complex political movement, but a journey to heal a fractured family. When everything is reduced to domestic matters, no one has to answer for the billions who died. No one has to confront the long-term consequences of a collapsed regime. everything is resolved with an embrace, a meaningful death, and a symbolic reunion. This is an extremely effective storytelling technique, but also a dangerous one. It allows audiences to walk away without considering collective responsibility, because responsibility has been individualized and then closed off with emotion. Return of the Jedi chooses family as a safe bridge across issues that, if addressed directly, would make the story far too heavy to remain a myth. 1. This is not the end of evil. It is only evil changing shape. Back then, when the Death Star exploded and the Emperor vanished, I, like many others, believed everything was over. Evil had been destroyed. Light had won. Fireworks and music made that belief almost impossible to doubt. But power does not work that way. The Empire is not a person who can die in a single moment. It is an entire machine. Officers' factories, propaganda systems, supply chains, and power structures embedded deeply in everyday life. Killing the Emperor and destroying the Death Star does not erase those things. It only creates a power vacuum, and power vacuums are always fertile ground for new violence. The film deliberately refuses to show what happens afterward because if it told the truth, there would be no fireworks. There would only be civil war purges, revenge, and prolonged political chaos. There would be former servants of the Empire changing uniforms. There would be people invoking freedom to seize power for themselves. Return of the Jedi ends at the most beautiful moment it possibly cannot. Because that moment is true, but because it is the only point at which the myth still stands. Evil does not disappear. It is merely retold in a way that makes us believe we are safe. And perhaps that is the darkest secret of this film. When Return of the Jedi closes, we still remember the feeling from back then, relief, joy, and the belief that everything had finally turned out fine. Fireworks in the sky, music swelling, familiar faces smiling. It is the ending we want to believe in, but the more I re-watch it and the longer I live in the world beyond the screen, the more I realise the film does not lie. It simply chooses not to tell the whole story. It hides unnamed sacrifices, erases guilt with beautiful images, and pushes moral questions aside so the myth can survive. What about you? When you re-watch Return of the Jedi today, which detail makes you feel uneasy for the first time? Leave a comment below. And which film would you like us to uncover next? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the next video might begin with your own memory.